Come learn about dominant and recessive gene variants, how they're used in an episode of Star Trek Voyager, and see a surprise special guest cameo appearance starting now. Hello! My name is Mohammed Noor. I'm a biology professor at Duke University, and I'm an occasional science consultant for the Star Trek universe. I'm very excited to talk with you today about dominant and recessive gene variants. I'm going to talk about what that means. I'm going to break a couple of misconceptions about them, and I'll tell you how that works sometimes. And I'll do all of this in the context of a kind of fun Star Trek Voyager episode. So without further ado, let's get started. This episode was called Favorite Son. In it, there was some deception happening that I'm not going to dig into here, but our favorite ensign, Harry Kim, had some alien DNA that got inserted into his cells. And that foreign DNA starts giving him spots as well as affecting his behavior. The doctor describes what's happening by saying, "These fragments have apparently been disguising themselves as the recessive elements normally within all DNA. But over the past few days, they've become increasingly dominant over his human genes." So let's talk about genetic dominance. But first, let me refresh your memory on some basic genetics and inheritance. DNA. DNA is the hereditary material found in all life on Earth. Now, stretches of DNA that contain a message like "make eye color brown" are called genes. And genes are packaged together in long threads called chromosomes. We have 23 pairs of such chromosomes, and we get one copy of each pair from our genetic mom and one copy of each pair from our genetic dad. Now, since we have 2 copies of every chromosome, we then have 2 copies of every gene as well. But what happens if the 2 copies give slightly different instructions? Well, let me use a real example. I should note that there are a lot of false examples of single gene traits out there, like dangly versus attached to earlobes, these folks, and eye color. Those are actually controlled by many genes on different chromosomes, not just one gene. But the texture of earwax, and no, I'm not going to show real earwax, is largely controlled by variants at one gene. There's a dry wax gene variant and a wet wax gene variant. If you have 2 copies of dry, your earwax is dry. If you have 2 copies of wet, your earwax is wet. But what if you have one of each? The answer is, it's wet. As such, we say the wet gene variant is dominant over the dry variant, and the dry gene variant is recessive to the wet one. Basically, if you have 2 different gene variants together in a person, and the trait looks like what someone has with 2 copies of just one of those variants, that one variant is dominant because it dominates over the other one in making the final trait. Now, I want to stress a few things. First, the dominant trait is not necessarily better or worse. Some disease gene variants are genetically dominant, for example, like the one causing Huntington's disease. And some gene variants causing disease are recessive, like the one for the blood disease sickle cell anemia. Now, dominance also doesn't say anything about how common the trait is. For example, dry earwax is more common in people of East Asian ancestry, while wet earwax is more common in Europe and Africa. Now, another thing I want to stress is that dominance is always relative to some other specific gene variant. So let me use the ABO blood group as an example. So 2 copies of the gene variant for A make A blood. 2 copies of the variant for O make O blood. If you have the gene variants for A and O together, you have blood type A. So A is dominant to O. But if you have the gene variants for A and B together, you have blood type AB. Neither one of them is dominant to the other. So the dominance of the A gene variant is specifically in relation to the O variant. Now you may be wondering, what makes something dominant? Well, it varies. Sometimes the recessive one just doesn't make a protein product, or maybe not enough of it, so the dominant one is all that your cells can detect. As an example, the protein from a gene called MC1R helps deposit brown and black pigments into hair. If you have 1 or 2 copies of the common variants for it, you'll often have brown or black hair. But there are MC1R gene variants that are bad at this job. And if you have 2 copies of those variants, you often get red hair because less of the pigment got deposited. Those red hair variants are recessive to the more common black and brown variants, and the black and brown variants are dominant to the red ones. Coming back to this Voyager episode, the Doctor said, "These fragments have apparently been disguising themselves as the recessive elements normally within all DNA, but over the past few days they've become increasingly dominant over his human genes." Well, this explanation has a good side. It explains why Ensign Harry Kim's spots didn't come out earlier. If the alien DNA was recessive to his human DNA, then he would look human. But as it became dominant to his human gene variants, he would start getting spots and exhibiting the behaviors. That's good. But there's a problem. The Doctor was using his explanation for why he didn't see the foreign DNA before. When you have one copy of a recessive gene variant, its effects on the trait aren't visible, but the DNA is still very much there. So if the Doctor had looked at Harry's DNA, he should have been able to see the alien parts.
Poor Harry. Womp, womp, womp.
Still, it's nice that the writers incorporated some useful genetics terms into an interesting episode of Voyager. Had you picked up on this use of dominance and recessive in the episode? And do you know of other examples of dominant and recessive gene variants? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for tuning into BioTrekkie Explains. See you next time.